I know it's a gray day here in Philadelphia, but for a moment, imagine yourself under the sea with this clownfish and its anemone. Or is it an anemone and its clownfish? It's both, because these animals live together in what's called a symbiotic partnership. Today, I hope to convince you of the power and vulnerability of symbioses like this one. Symbiosis is a spectrum. We humans spend a lot of energy worrying about and avoiding kinds of symbionts that can harm us, things like pathogens and parasites. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are symbiotic arrangements that can benefit all parties. These are called mutualisms, like the clownfish that protects the anemone while the anemone feeds the clownfish. In mutualism, two completely different organisms invest in one another to become more than the sum of their parts. The corals that build tropical reefs are a perfect example. When you look at this picture, notice how clear that water is. That's because corals grow in really shallow, warm waters where there's actually very little nutrients or plankton for animals to eat. And yet coral reefs are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They're home to around a quarter of ocean species, giving them the nickname the rainforests of the sea. This is due to corals, which are the literal bedrock of reefs. They build these complex structures that fish and other animals then flock to. And all this diversity has huge benefits for people too. Reefs provide jobs in tourism and fishing and protect our coastlines from dangerous storms and waves. They're also a promising source of a lot of novel pharmaceuticals. So how does all of this productivity and growth come when there are so few nutrients to work with? The answer all hinges on a really powerful mutualism. Corals may look just like rocks, but they are animals. Each colony is made of many small polyps, like little mouths, and each polyp is stuffed with millions of tiny dinoflagellates. These are microscopic algae that live inside of the coral's cells. Here's the bargain. In exchange for a safe place to live and some trace nutrients from the coral animal, the dinoflagellates photosynthesize and spin tropical sunlight into sugar, most of which they then pass back to the coral host. Some corals get over 90% of the calories that they need from algal photosynthesis. But this nutrient trade is so delicately calibrated that it's really sensitive to environmental change. In particular, when it gets too hot, corals expel their algae in a stress response called coral bleaching. Without the colorful dinoflagellates, corals are just white. And without the nutrients that their symbiotic partner provides, bleached corals start to starve and are likely to die. Luckily, they don't always, but if a coral is going to recover, it has to get its symbionts back. As the dinoflagellates return and regrow throughout the colony, they bring color back until the colony is considered recovered, like this one here. But even though this process is absolutely crucial for reef survival in the future, we don't understand it all that well. So I was curious whether the bargain between corals and their symbiotic algae changes in the wake of coral bleaching, as corals have to overcome this massive stress. To answer this question, I focused on understanding the transfer of sugar from the algae to the coral. I sampled corals and put them into heated tanks for a few weeks until they started to bleach. Then I removed the heaters, let the corals recover for about a month. My goal was to trace where the benefits of symbiosis ended up, and to figure out whether everyone was getting their fair share of that photosynthetic sugar. So I added a special labeled carbon molecule that only the algae can absorb via photosynthesis and then pass along to the coral. Then I could analyze the amount of that special carbon molecule in the algae versus in the coral tissues to track who was getting how much sugar. I expected that corals with more algal symbionts should be getting more food from photosynthesis. But instead, I saw that corals with the most algae didn't necessarily get any more food. This was surprising, because if you think of algae like farmers, they're the primary producers of this relationship. And you would think that more of those active farmers should mean more food for the coral to work with. Instead, bigger algal populations got more selfish. To figure out why corals with the most algae weren't benefiting more, I calculated a sort of algal profit margin of photosynthetic sugars. And I hope you can see that as algal density increases, so does that profit margin, but only for the algae. In other words, the algae that grew back the fastest after coral bleaching were still photosynthesizing and putting away plenty of sugar, but less of that sugar was ending up in the coral. I think this is because after bleaching causes algae to be expelled, some of the algae that remain have to invest less in cooperating with the mutualism in order to fuel their own regrowth, in order to power that coral recovery. In sum, I've found evidence that coral symbionts shift along this symbiosis spectrum from mutualism towards parasitism in the aftermath of coral bleaching. And this is really bad for corals because it means that the bleaching recovery process is intrinsically stressful. The corals essentially have to support a deadbeat symbiont population for a little while they recover. But even this suboptimal arrangement could have worked in the past. When bleaching events were rare, corals could probably afford to handle a temporary parasite while their symbiont population rebounded until it could contribute productively again to the coalition. Unfortunately, though, the oceans are getting hotter, and corals can't afford to be giving these loans. They are bleaching more often, and this bleach recovery cycle is getting harder for them to bear. Now that we know that symbiosis recovery is itself stressful to the coral, climate change is more than ever an existential threat to coral reefs. I do get some hope from the fact that algal strategies are dynamic. It means that this mutualism can respond to environmental change and can actively shift the way that it uses energy in response to novel stress. I think the real question right now is, can we match that adaptability? Are we humans willing to change how we use energy and what we invest in the face of global climate change? I'm searching for what may help corals overcome this unprecedented challenge. Hopefully, biologists and conservationists can figure out how to keep reef ecosystems alive long enough for us to decarbonize and curb climate change together. Thank you.